The rain hammered against the windows of Pine Valley Elementary School on that gray October morning in 1998, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the parking lot where parents would normally be arriving for pickup in a few hours. Inside room 14, 23 sixth graders sat hunched over their desks, pencils scratching against paper as they worked through their weekly spelling test. Their teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Thornton, paced slowly between the rows, her sensible shoes making soft clicks against the worn linoleum floor. Nobody could have predicted that within the next 6 hours, every single person in that classroom would vanish without a trace, leaving behind one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at the small rural school nestled in the heart of Montana's Glacier County. Pine Valley was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where unlocked doors were still the norm, and where the biggest crime in recent memory had been someone stealing pumpkins from Old Man Fletcher's patch 3 Halloweens prior. With a population of barely 800 souls, the town existed in a bubble of innocence that felt increasingly rare as the millennium approached. Mrs. Thornton had taught at Pine Valley Elementary for 12 years, and her 6th grade class of 1998 was particularly close-knit. These weren't just students to her, they were kids she'd watched grow up since kindergarten. There was Tommy Martinez, the class clown who could make even the grumpiest substitute teacher crack a smile. Ashley Williams sat in the front row, her hand shooting up eagerly whenever a question was asked, her thick glasses reflecting her genuine love of learning. In the back corner, quiet David Kim sketched elaborate dragons in the margins of his notebooks, his artistic talent already far beyond his 11 years. The twins, Emma and Ethan Cooper, shared that uncanny ability that some siblings possess to communicate without words, often finishing each other's sentences and sharing inside jokes that left their classmates bewildered. Lisa Park, the fastest runner in their grade, was already being scouted by the middle school track coach despite being only in 6th grade. And then there was Jake Morrison, the gentle giant who stood a full head taller than his classmates but wouldn't hurt a fly, often seen helping younger kids tie their shoes or reach books on high shelves. These were the faces that would soon stare out from missing person flyers posted on every telephone pole, storefront window, easements and bulletin board within a 50-mile radius of Pine Valley. And the spelling test that morning covered words they'd been studying all week. Definitely, separate occurred necessary. Simple words that would take on a haunting significance in the weeks to come, as investigators would pore over every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every detail that might explain what happened to 23 children and their teacher. And at approximately 10:45 a.m., Mrs. Thornton collected the completed tests and announced that they would be taking their scheduled bathroom break before moving on to mathematics. This was part of their established routine, one that the children knew by heart. The class would line up in 2 neat rows, boys and girls separated, and walk quietly down the hallway to the restrooms near the main office. Principal Janet Foster later told investigators that she saw the class walking past her open office door at exactly 10:47 a.m. She waved at Mrs. Thornton, who smiled and waved back. It was such an ordinary moment, so perfectly normal, that it would torment Principal Foster for years afterward. How could she have known she was witnessing the last confirmed sighting of 24 people who would never be seen again? The next verified timeline entry came from the school custodian, Harold Burns, who was mopping the floors in the East Wing when he noticed that room 14 was empty at 11:15 a.m. This struck him as odd because he knew Mrs. Thornton's schedule by heart after years of working around her class routines. They should have been back from their break and deep into math lessons by then. Harold walked down the hallway toward the restrooms, thinking perhaps they were taking longer than usual. The hallway was silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled sounds of other classes going about their normal Tuesday activities. When he reached the restrooms, he found them empty. No voices, no shuffling feet, no signs that anyone had been there recently. A cold knot began forming in Harold's stomach as he retraced his steps to room 14. The classroom sat exactly as Mrs. Thornton had left it. Spelling tests were stacked neatly on her desk, waiting to be graded. Math textbooks lay open to page 127, ready for the lesson that would never come. Backpacks hung on their assigned hooks along the back wall, lunch boxes tucked safely inside, but containing sandwiches that would grow stale and fruit that would slowly rot as days turned to weeks. But most unsettling of all were the personal items left behind in ways that suggested sudden, unexpected departure. Ashley's glasses case sat open on her desk, as if she'd just removed her glasses to clean them. Tommy's pencil lay on the floor beside his chair, the eraser end still warm from nervous chewing. David's sketchbook was open to a half-finished drawing of a castle, the pencil marks so fresh they smudged when Harold accidentally brushed against the page. Harold's hands were shaking when he picked up the wall phone in Mrs. Thornton's classroom and dialed the main office. His voice cracked as he told Principal Foster what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found. Within minutes, Foster was standing in the doorway of room 14, her face draining of color as the reality of the situation sank in. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic phone calls and increasingly desperate searches. Every room in the school was checked and rechecked. The playground equipment was examined inch by inch. The basement, the attic, supply closets, the gymnasium, the cafeteria, kitchen, every possible hiding spot was explored with growing panic. Teachers and staff members began arriving as word spread, even though it was barely past noon. Parents started gathering in the parking lot after receiving hurried phone calls from the school secretary, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, whose voice grew more strained with each call she made. "There's been an incident," she would say, the words feeling inadequate and terrifying all at once. "Please come to the school immediately." By 1 p.m., the Glacier County Sheriff's Department had been notified. Deputy Alan Murphy arrived to find a scene that would challenge every assumption he'd ever made about small-town safety. Deputy Murphy had been born and raised in Pine Valley, had attended the very same elementary school 25 years earlier. He knew these families personally, had coached some of these kids in Little League, had watched them ride their bikes through town and play in the park on summer afternoons. The initial investigation focused on the most logical explanations. Had there been a field trip that somehow wasn't properly documented? Had Mrs. Thornton decided to take the class outside for an impromptu nature walk? Could they have gotten confused and ended up in the wrong part of the building? But each theory crumbled under scrutiny. There were no field trips scheduled for that day. Mrs. Thornton was meticulous about following protocols and would never have taken students anywhere without proper authorization. And the school security, while minimal by today's standards, still required visitors to sign in at the main office, and there was no record of anyone suspicious entering the building that morning. But the first 24 hours of the investigation would later be described by FBI profilers as textbook perfect and completely baffling. Every procedure was followed, every lead was pursued, every possibility was explored with methodical precision. Search teams combed through the surrounding forests, their voices echoing through the pine trees as they called out names: Tommy, Ashley, David, Emma, Ethan. Bloodhounds were brought in from the state capitol, their sensitive noses working to pick up any scent trail that might lead to answers. But the dogs seemed as confused as their human counterparts, circling the school building repeatedly before sitting down with frustrated whines, as if the trail simply ended at the school's front steps. As news of the disappearance spread beyond Pine Valley's borders, the media descended on the small town like vultures. Reporters from Helena, Billings, and eventually national news outlets set up camp in the school parking lot, their satellite trucks and camera crews, creating a surreal circus atmosphere in a place where the most exciting event in recent memory had been the annual Harvest Festival. The families of the missing children found themselves thrust into a nightmare that played out on television screens across the country. Margaret Martinez, Tommy's mother, would later describe those first few days as feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. "You see these stories on the news," she told investigators, "and you feel bad for those families, but you never think it could happen to you. Never in a million years." The Williamses, Ashley's parents, transformed their modest ranch home into an impromptu command center, with maps spread across their kitchen table and phones ringing at all hours as tips and theories poured in from across the nation. Ashley's father, Robert Williams, took leave from his job at the local hardware store and spent 18-hour days coordinating search efforts with law enforcement, his face growing more haggard with each passing day. David Kim's parents faced an additional layer of complexity as one of only 3 Asian families in Pine Valley. Some investigators and media outlets initially focused on whether the family's ethnicity might have played a role in the disappearance, in a line of inquiry that proved both hurtful and fruitless. David's mother, Dr. Susan Kim, was a respected physician at the county hospital, and his father, Michael, taught high school mathematics. They were as integrated into the community as any family could be, yet they found themselves having to defend their belonging in their own hometown. The Cooper twins' disappearance hit the community particularly hard because of their visibility in town activities. Emma sang in the church choir every Sunday, her clear soprano voice carrying across the small sanctuary with angelic beauty. Ethan played on the youth soccer team and was known for his sportsmanship and kindness to opposing players. Their parents, Linda and Frank Cooper, owned the town's only bakery, and the sight of their shop sitting closed day after day served as a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen their community. Lisa Park's athletic abilities had made her something of a local celebrity, with adults often stopping to watch her run laps around the school track during recess. Her parents, both teachers at the high school, found themselves analyzing every conversation they'd had with their daughter, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened. Had she mentioned feeling afraid? Had anyone been watching her during her runs? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. Jake Morrison's size and gentle nature had made him a favorite among the younger students at Pine Valley Elementary. His parents, dairy farmers who had worked the same land for 3 generations, they struggled to understand how their son could simply vanish from a place they'd always considered safe. Jake's father, William Morrison, organized volunteer search parties that would continue for months, long after official search efforts had been scaled back. And at the center of it all was Mrs. Rebecca Thornton, the teacher who had dedicated her life to educating and protecting children. And her husband, James, was a long-haul trucker who had been on the road in Colorado when the disappearance occurred. The guilt he felt over not being there to somehow prevent or solve the mystery would eat at him for years. Rebecca's sister, Patricia, moved to Pine Valley temporarily to help coordinate search efforts and serve as a liaison with the media, and her own teaching career put on indefinite hold. As the investigation entered its 2nd week, FBI agents arrived from the Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia. These were the experts called in for the most complex and baffling cases, profilers who had studied every kind of criminal mind imaginable. But even they admitted that the Pine Valley case defied conventional categorization. Special Agent Victoria Hayes, the lead profiler on the case, would later write in her official report that the disappearance exhibited characteristics that seemed almost impossible when taken together, and the complete absence of physical evidence suggested sophisticated planning and execution. The timing during a routine bathroom break indicated intimate knowledge of the school's daily schedule. Yet the target, 23 children and their teacher, seemed to serve no logical purpose for any known criminal motivation. Stranger abductions of children are typically crimes of opportunity involving 1 or 2 victims, Agent Hayes explained to the gathered law enforcement officials during a briefing held in Pine Valley's community center. Mass abductions require enormous resources, multiple perpetrators, and usually have clear political or financial motivations. This case fits none of those patterns. The investigation expanded to examine every aspect of the victims' lives and the school's operations. Background checks were run on every employee, volunteer, and frequent visitor to Pine Valley Elementary. Mrs. Thornton's personal life was scrutinized with uncomfortable intensity, her phone records analyzed, her relationships questioned, her financial situation examined for any signs of distress that might explain a decision to flee with her students. Similar investigations were conducted for each family, a process that felt invasive and traumatic but was necessary to eliminate the possibility of parental involvement. Bank accounts were examined for unusual transactions, but travel records were checked for any signs of secret trips or meetings. Social connections were mapped, and analyzed for potential links to criminal organizations or cults. One early theory focused on the possibility of a cult recruitment operation. The late 1990s had seen several high-profile cult-related incidents, and the mass disappearance of children fit certain patterns associated with religious extremist groups. FBI agents researched every known cult operating in Montana and surrounding states, looking for connections to Pine Valley or evidence of recruitment activities targeting children. Another theory centered on human trafficking. Though the logistics of moving 24 people without detection seemed nearly impossible in a rural area where strangers were immediately noticed. Still, investigators traced every truck route, every flight path, every possible means of transportation that could have been used to remove the victims from the area. And the possibility of a cover-up within the community itself was also explored, though reluctantly. Could the entire town be hiding something? Was there a conspiracy of silence protecting someone or something that the outside world wasn't meant to discover? These questions created tension and suspicion among neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades, fracturing relationships and creating an atmosphere of paranoia that persisted long after investigators moved on to other theories. As weeks turned to months, the case began to take on an almost mythical quality in the national consciousness. Pine Valley became synonymous with mystery and loss, a place where innocence had been shattered in the most incomprehensible way possible. Psychics arrived claiming to have visions of the missing children. Conspiracy theorists proposed increasingly elaborate scenarios involving everything from government experiments to alien abductions to interdimensional portals. The families struggled to maintain hope as the one-year anniversary of the disappearance approached. Support groups were formed, grief counselors were brought in, and memorials were planned. But there was no closure, no resolution, no answers to the fundamental question that haunted everyone who had been touched by the case. What happened to the children of Room 14? The town of Pine Valley would never be the same. Property values plummeted as families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of that October morning. The elementary school was eventually closed, the building standing empty for years before finally being torn down in 2005. Where Room 14 once stood, there now grows a small memorial garden, 24 trees planted in memory of those who vanished. But memories and memorials could not fill the void left by unanswered questions. As 1999 turned to 2000, and the new millennium brought fresh hopes and fears to the world, and the case of the Pine Valley disappearance remained as mysterious as ever. The FBI maintained an open file, periodically reviewing evidence and following up on tips, but the trail had grown cold. Local law enforcement changed hands as sheriffs retired and deputies moved on, but the case files remained, lit and passed down like a cursed inheritance to each new generation of investigators. The parents of the missing children aged visibly, their faces bearing the weight of endless wondering, their lives frozen in time at that moment when everything changed forever. And so the years passed, each one taking them further away from that October morning in 1998, each one making the possibility of answers seem more remote. The story became local legend, then regional folklore, and finally a footnote in databases of unsolved cases that law enforcement agencies maintain for the mysteries that refuse to be solved. Until 27 years later, when Margaret Martinez received a friend request on Facebook that would change everything once again. The notification appeared on Margaret Martinez's phone screen at 11:47 p.m. on a cold February night in 2025. She had been lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly through social media posts about grandchildren and retirement parties, when the small red dot appeared above her Facebook icon. Friend requests were rare for Margaret these days. Most of her real friends had been connected to her for years, and she was cautious about accepting strangers into her digital life. But this request made her blood run cold. The profile picture showed a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with dark hair and familiar brown eyes that she recognized instantly, even after 27 years. The name listed was Thomas Martinez Santos, and beneath it, the hometown showed as Pine Valley, Montana. And Margaret's hands began to shake as she stared at the screen. Tommy. Her Tommy, who had been 11 years old when he vanished from Room 14, would be 38 now if he was still alive. This young man looked exactly like Tommy had as a child, but aged appropriately. The bone structure was identical, the slight dimple in his chin that Margaret had kissed 1,000 times when he was small. The way his left eyebrow sat just a fraction higher than his right. She sat up in bed so quickly that her husband, Carl, stirred beside her. They had married 15 years after Tommy's disappearance. Finding solace in their shared understanding of loss, Carl had lost his daughter in a car accident in 2001. He understood the particular kind of grief that comes with a child's death. Though Margaret's grief was complicated by the absence of closure, the endless wondering that had defined her existence for nearly 3 decades. What is it? Carl mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Margaret couldn't speak. She simply held out the phone, her entire body trembling as Carl sat up and took the device. His expression shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching fear as he processed what he was seeing. "Margaret," he said carefully, "this could be anyone. People create fake profiles all the time. Someone could be playing a cruel joke." But even as he said it, Carl knew this was different. He had seen hundreds of photographs of Tommy over the years, had helped Margaret maintain the memorial website she'd created, had watched her study age progression photographs that FBI specialists had created. This young man bore an uncanny resemblance to those computer-generated predictions of what Tommy might look like as an adult. Margaret's finger hovered over the accept button for nearly 10 minutes before she finally pressed it. Immediately, a message notification appeared. With trembling hands, she opened it. "Mom, I know this must be confusing and scary. I can't explain everything in a message, but I need you to know that I'm okay. We are all okay. Can we meet? I'm in Helena. Please don't call the police yet. There are things you need to understand first. I love you. I never stopped loving you. Tommy." None. Mun. The message included a phone number and an address for a hotel in Helena, about 2 hours' drive from Margaret's current home in Billings. She had moved away from Pine Valley in 2003, unable to bear the constant reminders and the pitying looks from neighbors who didn't know what to say to a mother whose child had simply vanished. Carl immediately wanted to call the FBI. The case file was still open, and Agent Victoria Hayes, though now retired, had maintained contact with the families over the years. This was exactly the kind of development that required immediate professional attention. But Margaret found herself hesitating, remembering the message's warning about not involving police. "What if it really is him?" she whispered. "What if calling the authorities scares him away again? What if I lose him a second time?" The debate continued through the night. They researched the Facebook profile, which had been created only 3 days earlier but contained several photos that showed the young man in various locations around Montana. The images were recent, based on the clothing styles and background details. Most importantly, several of the photos showed a distinctive scar on his left hand, a scar that matched one Tommy had received at age 7 when he fell from his bike and cut his hand on a broken bottle. By sunrise, Margaret had made her decision. She would drive to Helena alone, without notifying authorities, at least initially. Carl insisted on coming with her, and after some argument she agreed. They would meet this young man who claimed to be her son, listen to what he had to say, and then decide how to proceed. The 2-hour drive felt like an eternity. Margaret's mind raced through every possible scenario. Was this really Tommy? If so, where had he been for 27 years? What had happened to the other children and Mrs. Thornton? Why was he contacting her now after all this time? And most importantly, was this some elaborate hoax designed to exploit her grief? The address led them to a modest hotel on the outskirts of Helena. Margaret had texted the number from the Facebook message and received a reply within minutes, room 247. "Come alone, please. I understand if you bring someone, but it will be easier if it's just you at first." Margaret's heart was pounding as she walked down the hotel corridor, Carl beside her, despite the request for privacy. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would react, but all of her preparation evaporated when she knocked on the door of room 247. The man who opened the door was undeniably her son. 27 years melted away in an instant. The boy she had lost was standing before her, grown into a man but unmistakably Tommy. He had the same habit of running his hand through his hair when nervous, the same way of shifting his weight from foot to foot when uncomfortable. When he smiled tentatively at her, she saw the same gap between his front teeth that he'd had as a child, a gap they'd planned to fix with braces when he entered middle school. "Mom," he said simply, and Margaret collapsed into his arms, sobbing with the intensity that surprised them both. For several minutes they simply held each other while Carl stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure whether to intrude on the reunion or maintain his distance. Finally Tommy, because despite 27 years and all logic, this was definitely Tommy, gently led Margaret into the room and gestured for Carl to enter as well. "I know you have questions," Tommy began, his voice carrying traces of the boy Margaret remembered but deepened by decades of experiences she couldn't imagine. "I will try to explain everything, but some of it is going to be hard to believe." Over the next 3 hours, Tommy told them a story that defied every assumption investigators had made about the Pine Valley disappearance. The children and Mrs. Thornton hadn't been kidnapped by strangers. They hadn't been taken by a cult or traffickers or government agents. They had walked willingly through a door that shouldn't have existed, following someone they thought they could trust. "Do you remember Mr. Foster?" Tommy asked. "Principal Foster's husband. He used to substitute teach sometimes, helped with maintenance around the school." Margaret nodded slowly. Daniel Foster had been a quiet man, well-liked by students and staff. He had died in a car accident in 2001, 3 years after the disappearance. His death had been one of several tragedies that had befallen Pine Valley in the years following the vanishing, adding to the town's reputation as a cursed place. "He didn't die in 2001, Tommy said quietly. "And at least, not the way everyone thinks. The man who died in that car accident was someone else, someone who looked like him. The real Daniel Foster was with us." The story Tommy told over the next hour challenged everything Margaret thought she knew about reality. According to him, Daniel Foster had been part of a secret government program that dated back to the 1950s, an offshoot of the MK-Ultra experiments that had officially been terminated decades earlier. But this particular branch had continued operating in secret, focusing on children with specific psychological profiles. "They weren't interested in all children," Tommy explained. "They were looking for kids who showed certain traits: creativity, empathy, intelligence, but also something they called psychological flexibility. Kids who could adapt to new situations quickly, who didn't get stuck in rigid thinking patterns." Mrs. Thornton, according to Tommy, had been unknowingly helping to identify such children for years. At her teaching evaluations, her behavioral reports, her recommendations, all of it had been funneled to Foster, who was actually a government psychologist working under deep cover. The bathroom break on that October morning had been deliberately timed. Foster had waited in the hallway, dressed in his familiar maintenance coveralls, carrying a clipboard that made him look official and purposeful. When the class emerged from the restrooms, he had approached Mrs. Thornton with what appeared to be an urgent message from the principal. "There's been a gas leak detected in the main building," he had told her. "We need to evacuate your class immediately through the back exit. The fire department is on their way, but we can't wait." Mrs. Thornton, trusting Foster completely, had followed his instructions without question. She had led her students toward what they thought was a temporary evacuation, walking calmly toward the back of the school where Foster said emergency vehicles were waiting. But there were no emergency vehicles. Instead, there was a windowless van and several adults in casual clothing who looked like social workers or counselors. Foster introduced them as special evacuation coordinators, who would take the children to a safe location until the gas leak could be resolved. Mrs. Thornton realized something was wrong just as we were getting into the van, Tommy remembered, his voice taking on a distant quality as he accessed memories he'd clearly tried to suppress. She started asking questions, demanding to see identification. That's when they grabbed her, and the children, confused and frightened, had been loaded into the van despite Mrs. Thornton's struggles and protests. Foster and his associates had used a combination of authority and reassurance to maintain control, telling the children that their teacher was feeling sick from the gas leak and needed medical attention. "Where did they take you?" Carl asked, speaking for the first time since Tommy had begun his story. "Montana State Hospital," Tommy replied, "but not the regular hospital. There's a wing that doesn't officially exist, underground levels that aren't on any public blueprint. That's where they took us." For the next 15 years, according to Tommy, the children and Mrs. Thornton had been subjects in a psychological experiment designed to test the limits of human adaptability and group dynamics. They had been told that the outside world had been destroyed in a nuclear war, that they were the survivors of their community, and that their only hope of eventual freedom was to participate in the research program that would help rebuild civilization. The facility had been designed to feel like a small underground city, complete with residential areas, classrooms, recreational facilities, and even simulated outdoor spaces with artificial sunlight. The children had continued their education, celebrated birthdays and holidays, formed relationships and hierarchies, all while being monitored constantly by researchers who studied their every interaction. "They made it feel real," Tommy said, his voice hollow with remembered pain. "We had routines, responsibilities, even hopes for the future. They told us that when the radiation levels outside dropped enough, we'd be allowed to return to the surface and help repopulate Montana." Mrs. Thornton had figured out the truth first, sometime around the 5-year mark. She had begun noticing inconsistencies in the stories they were told, questioning the lack of contact with other survivor communities, and demanding proof of the nuclear disaster that had supposedly destroyed the world above. Her rebellion had been swift and brutal to witness. One day she was there, continuing to protect and teach her students as she had for their entire captivity. The next day she was gone, and Foster explained that she had volunteered for a special assignment that would help secure their eventual freedom. And the children never saw her again. "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I don't know for sure," Tommy admitted. "But I think she tried to expose what was happening to us. And I think they killed her for it." The program had continued for 10 more years after Mrs. Thornton's disappearance, and the children, now teenagers and then young adults, had been given increasing responsibilities within the facility. They had been told they were being prepared for leadership roles in the new world, trained in skills that would be essential for rebuilding society. But as they matured, more of them began to question the narrative they'd been fed since childhood. Jake Morrison, the gentle giant who had grown into a man of enormous physical strength, had begun testing the limits of their confinement. Ashley Williams, her childhood love of learning now focused on finding inconsistencies in their captors' stories, had started documenting everything she could remember about their previous lives. The twins, Emma and Ethan Cooper, had used their uncanny ability to communicate without words to share doubts and observations that gradually spread throughout the group. David Kim had channeled his artistic talents into creating detailed maps of the facility, searching for weaknesses or hidden areas. Lisa Park had maintained her physical conditioning, preparing for an escape attempt that seemed increasingly necessary. "We realized we had to get out," Tommy continued. "But we also knew that if we tried to escape as a group, we'd never make it. The facility was too well guarded, too isolated. Our only chance was if some of us stayed behind to create a distraction while others made it to the surface." The escape had been planned for months, with different groups of survivors taking on different roles. Some would create chaos and confusion within the facility, drawing security attention away from the exit points. Others would attempt to reach the surface and get word to authorities about what was happening below ground. Tommy had been part of the group that made it out, along with Ashley Williams and Jake Morrison. But the cost of their freedom had been terrible. "The facility was destroyed," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whether it was an accident or intentional, I don't know. But there was an explosion about 6 hours after we escaped, and the whole underground complex collapsed." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. "The others," she managed to say. Emma, Ethan, David, Lisa, are they? Tommy's silence was answer enough. We tried to go to the authorities, he continued after a long pause. But Foster and his people had prepared for that possibility. They had documentation showing that we were mental patients who had been institutionalized since childhood, so that we suffered from shared delusional disorders and couldn't be trusted as reliable witnesses. The three survivors had found themselves in an impossible situation. They had no proof of their true identities, no way to verify their memories of Pine Valley or their families. The hospital records showed that Thomas Martinez Santos, Ashley Williams Grant, and Jacob Morrison Foster had been patients since 2000, suffering from severe trauma and dissociative disorders following the deaths of their families in various accidents. They had thought of everything, Tommy said bitterly. New names, new histories, medical records going back years. As far as the world was concerned, we were nobody. The children who disappeared from Pine Valley in 1998 had simply vanished, and we were three unrelated mental patients with elaborate fantasy lives. For the past 12 years, the three survivors had been living under their assumed identities, working low-profile jobs, staying off official records as much as possible. They had maintained contact with each other but avoided any attempt to reconnect with their original families, knowing that doing so would only bring pain and disbelief. But something had changed recently. Foster, the man who had orchestrated their imprisonment, had died this time for real, according to Tommy. And with his death, some of the surveillance and control mechanisms that had kept them in hiding had apparently been lifted. Ashley found records, Tommy explained. Hidden files that Foster had kept as insurance, probably in case his superiors tried to eliminate him too. Documents that prove what happened to us, what happened to Mrs. Thornton, everything. Margaret's mind was reeling as she tried to process the implications of Tommy's story. If it was true, and despite its incredible nature, that something deep in her heart believed every word, then the disappearance of her son and his classmates hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been a deliberate crime, perpetrated by people who had been trusted to protect children. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "What's changed?" Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Because we are going to expose them," he said. "All of them. Everyone who was involved, everyone who covered it up, everyone who let it continue for 15 years. But we need help, and we need people to believe us." The envelope contained photocopies of documents that, if authentic, would prove the existence of the secret program and implicate dozens of government officials, the medical professionals and researchers. There were budget allocations for Project Pioneer, personnel files for staff members who didn't officially exist, and most damning of all, progress reports on the 23 subjects identified by their initials and case numbers. Margaret recognized her son's case number immediately, TM11A. The reports detailed his psychological development over 15 years of captivity, his responses to various stimuli and scenarios, his relationships with other subjects. Reading it felt like a violation, a reduction of her child's suffering to clinical observations and data points. But it was also proof, undeniable evidence that Tommy's impossible story was true. "We are meeting with a journalist next week," Tommy continued. "Someone who specializes in government cover-ups, who has the resources and connections to verify these documents and get the story out. But we wanted to contact our families first, to prepare them for what's coming." Carl, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke up. "What about the other families? The Williamses, the Kims, the Coopers? Do they deserve to know what happened to their children?" Tommy's expression grew even more pained. "Ashley is contacting the Williams family. Jake is reaching out to his parents. But the others, the ones who didn't make it out, we are not sure how to tell their families that their children are dead because of our escape attempt." The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. And the survivors had gained their freedom, but at the cost of their classmates' lives. They possessed evidence that could expose a massive government conspiracy and potentially prevent similar atrocities in the future. But revealing the truth would devastate families who had spent 27 years hoping their children might still be alive. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy shared more details about their captivity, their escape, and their life in hiding since 2013. He had learned electronics repair, working under the table for cash at small shops around Montana. Ashley had become a freelance writer, using her childhood love of reading to build a career that allowed her to work anonymously. Jake had found work on remote construction sites, his size and strength valuable in jobs that didn't require extensive background checks. They had each struggled with the psychological impact of their experiences. Tommy had battled depression and anxiety, complicated by survivor's guilt and the constant fear of being recaptured. All three had found it difficult to form lasting relationships, their ability to trust having been fundamentally damaged by their betrayal at the hands of authority figures. "I wanted to contact you so many times," Tommy told his mother as the sun began to set outside the hotel window. "Especially when I heard you'd remarried, when I saw pictures of you smiling again on social media. I was happy that you'd found some peace, but I was also terrified that reaching out would destroy that peace." Margaret reached across the small table and took her son's hand, feeling the familiar scar tissue from his childhood accident. "Nothing could be more important than knowing you are alive," she said firmly. "Nothing. London to chew." The reunion was interrupted by Tommy's phone buzzing with a text message. His expression changed as he read it, fear and urgency replacing the cautious hope that had characterized their conversation. "We need to leave," he said, standing quickly. "Ashley just got word that our journalist contact was found dead in his apartment this morning. Apparent suicide, but we don't believe it." The implications hit Margaret immediately. If Tommy's story was true, if there really was a government conspiracy that had operated for decades, then the people responsible would go to extraordinary lengths to prevent exposure. The death of a journalist investigating their activities was exactly the kind of response such people might employ. "Come with us," Tommy urged his mother and Carl, "at least until we can get somewhere safe and figure out our next move. If they know we are planning to go public, they might target our families too." Margaret found herself facing an impossible choice. She could return to her normal life, pretending this reunion had never happened, trying to forget the son she'd found and lost again in the space of a single day. Or she could trust Tommy completely, abandoning everything she'd built over the past 27 years, to help him expose the truth about what had happened to the children of Pine Valley. She looked at Carl, seeing her own fear and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They had built a quiet, peaceful life together, far from the tragedy and pain of her past. They had a house, a garden, retirement plans, grandchildren from Carl's other children who visited on weekends. But her son was asking for her help. Her son, who had been stolen from her by people who were supposed to protect children, who had survived 15 years of psychological torture and 12 years of hiding, that was finally ready to fight back. Margaret stood up and grabbed her purse. "Let's go," she said. As they prepared to leave the hotel room, Tommy handed her a second envelope, this one smaller and sealed. "What's this?" she asked. "Mrs. Thornton wrote it," Tommy said quietly, before she disappeared. "She asked me to give it to you if I ever got the chance. She said you were always her favorite parent to work with, that you really understood how much she cared about us kids." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Mrs. Thornton's familiar handwriting, unchanged despite years of captivity, filled a single page with words that had been written more than 2 decades earlier. "Dear Margaret, if Tommy is giving you this letter, it means something has happened to me and the children have found a way to survive without me. I need you to know that I tried everything I could to protect them, to get word to their families, to find a way out of this nightmare. They told us the world had ended, but I never believed it. I knew parents like you were out there, never giving up hope, never stopping the search for your babies. I want you to know that Tommy talked about you every day. He remembered every birthday party, every bedtime story, every hug. Your love kept him strong when everything else was designed to break his spirit. Please don't blame him or the others if they had to make impossible choices to survive. They are still the same beautiful children we lost that October morning, just carrying burdens no child should ever have to bear. Get them home, Margaret. Get them all home. With love and hope, Rebecca Thornton. By the time Margaret finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She looked up at Tommy, seeing not just her adult son, but the 11-year-old boy who had been ripped from her life so many years ago. "We are going to get them," she said fiercely. "All of them. We are going to make sure everyone knows what was done to you, and we are going to make sure it never happens again." And as they left the hotel and drove into the growing darkness, none of them could know that their reunion was being monitored by the same people who had orchestrated the Pine Valley disappearance. Hidden cameras had recorded their conversation, sensitive microphones had captured every word, and somewhere in an office building in Washington, D.C., decisions were being made about how to contain this latest threat to national security. The children of Room 14 were about to discover that their nightmare was far from over. But for the first time in 27 years, they weren't facing it alone. The truth about Pine Valley was finally going to come to light. Whether any of them would survive long enough to see justice served remained to be seen.